Great. Well, thank you all for coming. We want to ask everybody to go ahead and take their seats. I'm Chad Sweet, the co-founder and CEO of the Chertoff Group, and this is part of a series that we do on thought leadership in security issues that are affecting both government and the private sector. And today, we're fortunate to have great representatives from both the private sector and the government. And I'm going to go across here quickly. You have everyone's in detail bios. All of these individuals are extremely steeped in cybersecurity, not only from the standpoint of technical acumen, but they actually are doing this in practice every day. And so you're going to get to hear today, and I'd invite you to be thinking about the questions that you want to ask of them from that perspective, both decision makers that are making decisions to defend the country, as well as our private enterprise. And so with that, to my immediate left, we're grateful to have here Director Chris Krebs. He is the director of what's now being called CISA, formerly NPPD, that was formerly the National Protection Programs Division of DHS, and is now the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. And I'll let him say just a couple words about his background.
Thanks, Chad. So I came in March of 2017, initially as counselor of cyber and infrastructure issues to General Kelly when he was the secretary, moved on into various roles throughout the department. Prior to that, spent a few years at Microsoft, and before that, doing risk management consulting. And prior to that, I was in the Bush administration at DHS, where I had the pleasure of working for this guy.
And I had strong influence on his choice of sock collection, as you can see here. And to Chris's left is Dmitry Kuzanov, who is the Deputy Undersecretary for Artificial Intelligence at the Department of Energy. And as many of you all know, the Department of Energy isn't only just about energy. It actually handles the safety of our nuclear arsenal and a number of our national labs, Sandia, Los Alamos, et cetera, are all under the purview of DOE and manage huge amounts of critical information relevant to our country's infrastructure, and that all is constantly under cyber threat. So we're very much excited to have you here, Dmitry, and tell folks a little bit about your very impressive background.
Well, thank you. Great to be here. So I'm a former academic, in my first career as a professor of theoretical physics at Yale University, before coming into government right around 9/11, which was an interesting time to join. I came into the department, into the defense side, the national security side, and I've been moving around the department in various capacities, until through today so far.
Great.
Hopefully at the end of the day as well.
As we see with Deputy Secretary Shanahan, we'll just play it every day, one day at a time, right? But also, and I've heard of that little school, Yale. It's some shop up in Connecticut.
Up in New Haven
somewhere. So, yeah, thank you. It's great to have you on the panel. And to Dimitri's left is Bill Connor, the CEO of SonicWall, one of the world's largest enterprises that are doing real-time artificial intelligence applied to various cyber defense solutions. Bill?
Thank you, Chad. Great to be here. Bill Connor, CEO of SonicWall, carved out of Dell, so it's kind of been public, went private, got sold to Dell, and now it's back private again. I came in 2.5 years ago to take over as a CEO to really return SonicWall into kind of its flagship company. Probably number 1 or 2, depending on the industry analyst, of security for SMB. I'm sure we'll get into that today. And number 5 in enterprise and government. So kind of a good juxtaposition of seeing both things. And as Chad said, one of the things that attracted me to this company is it's been doing machine learning for over 20 years. Anyone that knows machine learning, big data, we're in over 215 countries with over 1.3 million sensors. So we've got one of the largest over time, thousands of terabits of artifacts of malware for malware cocktails that we're trying to bring to bear in this cyber arms race for the governments.
Great. Well, thank you. That's a great way to set the discussion. One of the things that I think is on all of our minds in terms of the current state of play is the upcoming 2020 elections. And clearly, our very foundation of the democracy of the republic was under attack in cyber. Chris, when we look at the mandate that you have at DHS, CISA has a critical role in helping in our federalist system, states and counties with their election infrastructure. Can you talk about, does AI help us in ways that we couldn't even think of in 2016?
So I think it could. It certainly could. When we think about our role at DHS and the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, we are in a supporting role to state and local. So Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, states determine the time, place, and manner of elections. So we are there to help provide information, additional capacity. In fact, just today we kicked off the second annual Tabletop the Vote. When I came in last summer, we were looking at a few things. One is, how do we get, in the emergency management and incident response community, on the physical side, you've got an annual great shakeout, a big nationwide earthquake exercise. Wanted to get that same kind of model for the election community. So we did it last year. We just kick it off again today. We are starting kind of at a crawl, walk, run. We're getting into that walking phase right now. And one of the things we're looking at is, as we get folks going into the right direction, making the right investments, getting, retiring legacy systems, configuring appropriately. When you think about kind of some of the exploits of 2016, particularly that Midwest state, aka Illinois, it was just SQL injection. And they just hadn't configured properly. So we're still dealing with some really basic issues. But at the same time, as we continue to push out capabilities, it opens up opportunity for AI and machine learning. One example is we've sent out a lot of these network sensors and the intrusion detection capabilities, and it can enable the states to take a harder, deeper look at their net flow. But we're talking across 50 states, just petabytes of data. No human can sort that.
Right.
So what are the algorithms that at least we can do that tier 1, tier 2 analyst triage and get the human in the loop, focus on the higher order stuff, really innovating at the top, pressing down on the standard, again, that analyst 1, analyst 2 layer work. So that's where we're putting a lot of our effort right now and working with the private sector on seeing what they're finding successful. But there's a huge opportunity space. But we have to keep in mind, again, that there is increasingly a haves and have-nots community out in the enterprise space. And we are really trying to shore up as much as possible the have-nots. And how do we do that in a smart way that doesn't kind of off-kilter that Federalist Society approach that you mentioned, and being cognizant of kind of moral hazard. If states have to invest, how do we help them invest smartly?
And in that regard, Director Krebs, it's interesting the haves and have-nots analogy that you use, because in the same way that in the corporate world, a lot of the Fortune 500 have multi-million-dollar budgets, but the small and mid-sized businesses do not, but they're absolutely a target. In a similar vein, the federal government has a vast amount of resources on the cyber side, but those states and counties that are empowered to do the elections have a much more lean budget environment. So, Bill, when you think about the way that SonicWall has been helping those small and mid-sized enterprises in the private sector, do you see a role for SonicWall or AI in general in helping the states and the counties?
Well, it's even more important for SMB because they don't have the resources, capital or human, much less the capability to put those together. So just like at Entrust, we try to do the physical, logical, and hardware security profile for the election machines and the networks they run. One of our largest verticals is state and local government because our security efficacy and because our cost point and reliability. So what we try to do is go out and show them the capability. And core to that is machine learning. And once we detect, we can prevent everywhere else. So this sensing network, we're able to find these new strains of malware that are coming out. And I don't care how they repopulate them, how they rebuild a malware cocktail, whether it's a new vodka or a different shape of vodka. And I guess if we're in London, it'd be gin. But since we're talking Russia, we'll leave it with vodka. The issue is how do you detect, but then prevent? And in our last quarter threat report, we talked about a new strain of malware that's coming out of Russia. And literally, it's evading all traditional technology sandboxes.
And how's it doing that?
It's doing it by going around be technical for a moment, it goes around hypervisor, emulation, and virtualization. And it went from about 74,000 last year on PDF and Office docs to 173,000 in Q1. Now, through May of this year, it's up to 244 just from January to May. Now, it was on financial and spam, and it's using predominantly PDFs, but you know, if you can do it in one form factor, there's multitudes of ways of doing it.
And you feel confident the attribution to Russia is either is it state actors or?
It's state sponsored.
State sponsored,
correct,
yeah.
correct. And so what's interesting about that is we've got that. Now, to Chris, your point, because I weaponize it for one thing doesn't mean I can't weaponize, because once I weaponize it, it's just how do I apply it?
Right.
And that's, you know, and the only reason we can see that is real-time deep memory inspection, which combines machine learning with processor memory-based inspection and forcing code to operate. And we wouldn't see it any other way.
So it's the Russian angle is very interesting. Chris has talked about it. You've talked about it. Dimitri, obviously the assets that you have to protect every day, you know, are of critical importance to the country and have profound implications for our defense. Are you seeing that a similar type of aggressive threat vector from Russian state actors or their surrogates?
You know, I'd like to kind of just step back and define, you know, we use AI very broadly to mean a lot of things, and just to kind of set the tone of what our lens is here as we talk about it in the department. There's a piece that's the machine learning. You know, what do you do once you have data? There's the data acquisition piece, remarkable technologies coming out, portable, small, smarter for multi-purpose. There's a decide part. You know, you get information, a lot of false positives, a lot of noise in the system. The question is, how do you know what is actionable? And the decide part is not trivial, and there isn't a big market pulling that. There's the autonomy part, how much do you let things go by themselves, the human AI interface. And we think about this envelope of technologies today, and it is not new in the sense that nothing we're really talking about is, especially AI has been around since the 40s, but two factors make it openly available to all sorts to use it. One is the amount of data. Chris mentioned petabytes. A standard unit today we throw around, you know, petabytes is a billion photos on your iPhone, you know, and if you're getting that every day and you have to find out what's in there, is there something to worry about, and is it actionable, and then another billion come in, it is really a non-trivial problem. It isn't anything you throw 1,000 or 100,000 analysts at. It just doesn't scale that way. And so when we think about, you know, what are the threats and what does the threat space look like, fact is that the technology, the availability of data to just about anybody at remarkable scales today, as opposed to 5 years ago or even 7 when the floppy was still, you know, a technology people could buy, and the ability to compute at petaflop scales today on chips. And the fact that these technologies are now readily available has opened up a frontier which is a bit of the Wild West of technologies. And I don't think we know exactly where it's going. It's opening opportunity for many to probe, to understand, positive and negative. And we're thinking about that very broadly in what does it mean. And we do see things, of course, but we worry about where things are going more so in how do we hedge against the future, because it's a bit of the Wild West right now in terms of this. You know, if you remember the internet back in the late 90s, mid 90s, before we worried about cybersecurity seriously as we do today, before we really understood how much it would become an integral part of everything we do. You know, we're all wired up and doing things, and without it we sometimes feel lost. We couldn't see it back then. AI is like that today. We know with where technologies are going, it's going to be touching us in ways, things talking to each other, machine to machine to machine, learning from each other in ways that will open up what the threat is, not just you know, today's threat, but tomorrow, and what the definition of actor is going to be. You know, I think what Bill said is true today, but I worry about, well, now you have machines in the loop. They're doing all kinds of things as well as part of the cycle of development and processing and probing. And that accelerates things
Dramatically.
in ways that I think is hard to appreciate.
And, well, Dimitri, and you brought up the point about the human in the loop, and Director Krebs, you said the same thing. And obviously, there are different models of AI and how it's being applied in the real world. The Department of Defense has a order that prohibits the use of kinetic force, lethal kinetic force, without a human in the loop. And my understanding, there's only one exception to that, and that's the DMZ in North Korea. Other than that, at least up to this point, AI is prohibited from making that final kill decision. It can assist in getting to a targeting profile, but that last element in the kill chain has to have a human in the loop. And some people have been asking, in the private sector, is there going to be a day where we would feel comfortable enough to let AI make life and death decisions? And if so, when would that come? And the response that a friend of mine who's much smarter than me said on this issue is, that day isn't just coming, it's not just against high-value terrorist targets in Yemen and Sana'a. It's happening right here in the United States today. It's happening in our cities, even right here in Washington. And what he meant by that was, I own a Tesla. Anyone who uses it in self-driving mode, which is an incredible experience, that moment, and when it's out in the wild driving on the road, if it encounters a life and death situation, it has to make a decision. And we've seen a couple of these cases, right, where people have been killed by autonomous vehicles. And the recent one that happened was a truck pulled right in front of a Tesla, and it had to make a decision to hit the truck and kill the driver, or swerve on the curve and take out a woman and her child, and the machine decided to go ahead and take out the driver. And so the decision in the future for life and death isn't in the future, it's actually happening right now. And if you look at, for you, Chris, and the infrastructure that you're protecting, DHS has really led the way on that automation with the CDM program, Continuous Diagnostics and Monitoring. Can you talk a little bit about, on your side, do you see the more and more of the ultimate decisions cutting out human behavior in order to keep pace with the cyber threat, or do you think there's always going to need to be a human in the loop?
So first things first, I will never own a Tesla based on what you said. I look forward to going and buying like a CJ5 that I can do all the upkeep and maintenance myself. There will always be humans in the process.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is not necessarily in the decision-making process, yes, but also in the development, the design phase as well. I've got really good, capable, trained analysts that understand the algorithms. Mm-hmm. And so if we lean on machine learning and algorithms down the road, then we're not going to have that pipeline to get to that level 5 analyst. So what I want is this kind of virtuous cycle of trained analysts that are working with the base, entry-level coders, help them understand the algorithms, and then you can help push them back on top of kind of that development cycle. Mm-hmm. So there will always be humans in the process.
Right.
Whether it's design, control, the governance structures around how these things are deployed. But I think we are going to need, whether it's Asimov's principles or something like that, that says these are the sorts of first principles that we are going to have to adhere to with human decision-making processes, but recognizing that humans are not infallible. But there are certain things that humans are just not. I don't think we're anywhere near letting go of the wheel on, so to speak.
Well,
that brings
we
us back.
are going to let go of the wheel on the Tesla, but I hear your point. I think on that model that you've described, basically using AI as an enabler so that you get the human to elevate and make those really high-order decisions. If you step back and look at right now, Bill, for the small and mid-sized businesses, like you said, they don't have that budget to be able to have those, even the analysts to push up to make the high-order decision. So how is it that you could help both states and counties as well as SMB to do that with the AI that you have, but then do you have any humans in the loop as well on that?
Playing off what the two gentlemen have said, you've got to put it in use case.
Yep.
And so there's There's people that are very involved early on in the models, depending on what use case you're building. Our model was security, network security, and it's the amount of data you collect and how you improve those equations over time and how you adapt to the various environments. So whether it's planes, trains, or automobiles, those are very different use cases in a machine learning or AI concept of what you're trying to do. If my CTO was here, he would be the first one to say, you know how easy it is to change one bit in software? Pretty damn easy. That's one bit means it's a self-driving car, train, or automobile, or what happens in London with a driver that goes rogue. That one bit change turns it into a missile. And it's a different paradigm. And believe me, people are going to be looking to do that because I don't need people then in the same way. I can do it remotely if I can find the way. So I think what we're trying to do is apply that in context of IoT, a network, traditional networking, firewalls, virtual, public cloud, private cloud, email, wireless, all the different ways things are communicating now, which is not just in an enterprise network. It's through public social networks, it's through apps, it's through infrastructure. Cloud apps are a whole new thing. People don't even know how to look at those yet in terms of, we just think we go to the cloud and it's safe. Well, not necessarily.
Well, you said, I think something I want to pick up on in a minute is this issue of how fast the algorithms learn. But Chris, you have
The one thing your use case point is exactly right in that when I'm looking at CDM, when I'm working with a civilian agency, whether it's DOE and working with Max and in the CIO shop at Energy, if we're just talking about a Windows box that's behaving abnormally, that may be out of policy somehow, it hasn't, for whatever reason, installed the latest patch, I want to be able to have a tier 1 or tier 2 automated process where I can put them in a walled garden, we can inspect, figure out, get it up to the policy, and then you can bring it back in. Then you can keep escalating where there's a point at which you flatten the machine, build it back up, whatever. But again, we're talking the business enterprise. We're talking just a machine that's sitting on a desk somewhere. But if there's a industrial control system application, or there's some life safety nexus, then we're talking completely different sort of governance model and the decision-making process. That's when you bring in, you have to look at, okay, where is the human in the loop on this process? And just like the Tesla example, what's the optimized decision point for human saying go?
So on that
Can I also add,
sure.
AI is still fragile today. We don't know how it works exactly. You take these volumes of data and you apply, what's called deep learning today. It takes our biggest computers to crunch through that. And effectively what it does, it takes these massive volumes of data and it distills what it finds as kind of the relevant small space of relevant degrees of freedom. What are the main things that capture most of what's in there? And then it creates a model based on those degrees of freedom. So if you know somebody's model, if they applied a certain amount of computing and found a model, you might be able with a more powerful computer to find a way to avoid that model. And so if you set up a model to avoid what to be sensitive to what you think is coming in, but you've only defined it with a certain extent of capability, it is possible to create richer models for which the model that you're thinking about is a subset, but you might find a way to avoid it because you'll find the pathways that are just not captured. So if you know someone else's model, if you can back out from the scale of what they've thrown at it, you can find ways. And the growth of adversarial AI is a nice example of that. But because we don't know exactly how AI or the learning piece comes to its model or its understanding of what's in the data, there are going to be problems with having it simply act all by itself unless the problem is sufficiently self-contained and small enough that there isn't that kind of latitude. But for rich problems of these very complex networks, I think you're going to have these specialists who have the subject matter knowledge to understand what is real and what's not. And I don't see how you can avoid that.
Do you think, based on the adversaries that you're up against, if you look at your point, Dimitri, that the algorithms, they learn, and the analogy, again, I'm not a data scientist, but a friend of mine who is said, look, the way to think about, there's different ways that algorithms learn. Like you said, one is analogy, if we think about language, no child, you know, if we're adults today, when we want to learn a language, we're probably going to take a class and we're going to have exercises and it's structured and then we learn it. Versus a child, when they're born, they have no instruction manual, but through iteration and exposure, they ultimately learn to speak. And so, to your point, my understanding is that the latter, i.e. that open learning with no structured guidance, is what ultimately can unlock some of the most powerful results. But because of the privacy rules and other constraints that we have in the West, what is your view about, all three of you, on are we going to find ourselves in this AI arms race at a disadvantage in a way that's debilitating, or can we strike a balance in because you all are sitting on vast amounts of data, some of which have huge privacy implications, and our citizens want to make sure that AI is used in a way that's appropriate. So, Chris, we'll start with you on does the adversary have a head start here or be able to leapfrog us because they're not constrained?
So I don't know if I have enough of a base of kind of knowledge to say whether China's ahead of us or Russia's ahead of us. I think everybody's going at this full tilt. China's certainly been very opportunistic in its data set collection. It's the polite way to put intellectual property theft and PII harvesting. And certainly they have not demonstrated a commitment to privacy, human rights, and things of that nature, and even some of the genetic testing that you've heard about.
Yep.
I have significant concerns there, but I still think that the innovative base, the innovation edge here in the United States, will keep us at the forefront, if not at the very top. But we do know between Putin, President Xi, they have both said that AI is a top priority. I think I look over to Dimitri and his, in Summit and all the exascale investments the DOE has made today. That is part of how we're going to keep our edge, because the stuff that he is doing over in his shop, and that we can all take some of the cascading benefits for federal network protection, for critical infrastructure protection.
And what are you doing? What you mentioned Summit. Can you? Is DOE?
Summit was last year,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There's a
Well,
new
so
hotness somewhere.
Yeah, the secretary is fully invested in both AI and the high-end at supercomputing. He recently announced Aurora, our exascale system, at Argonne and Frontier, coming in at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And these things are important because they allow us to push learning to extreme scales. Aggregation of data is really important. Without data, we haven't figured out how you learn in the machine learning sense from small data. So you need a lot of data. But that said, it's not just having data, the curation of the data, knowing what you have, that it's the right kind of data for the right kinds of things you're trying to learn is not a trivial problem. And the cleaning of the data and kind of the dull stuff in the data science is far harder than people appreciate. Otherwise, you could learn things that just don't make any sense. And you will probably learn a lot of that along the way. And so it's not just having data, it's making sure you have the right one. And I agree with Chris then, the edge will come by knowing the kind of data you have and having the right expertise sitting there to manage how we learn from this. And so aggregation is important, but doing it the right way is even more important than being able to push the envelope in learning and trying to understand whether what you're getting from this data is the right kind of information is yet another step.
And I think it's interesting that in the academic community, this growing data science community, UVA just established a school for data science. You led work at Yale. So there's this growing appreciation of the opportunity space out in front of us.
Do you think, though, Bill, in the United States, in the history of the world, when we've put our mind to do something, whether it was develop the first nuclear bomb with the Manhattan Project or put a man on the moon, when we do that, when the private sector and the government come together, we've been able to achieve mind-blowing things. Are we at a crossroads where our adversaries are investing at what I'll call a moonshot level, and yet the private sector is really where the vast majority of the R&D is today. Is the government collaboration in this space sufficient to keep us ahead?
It's never sufficient against, it's an arms race. So, my point of view is, at the end of the day, it all comes down to people that do this. And you can only have so many people that code so fast, on the good side and the bad side. Now, what deep learning, machine learning, AI is all about is trying to offload that so you can be smarter with this and have fewer do it. Well, the bad guys are doing that. I mean, they take our sandboxing technology and everybody else's, and they beat the hell out of them. Now, here's the difference. If it's a state-sponsored guy doing it in China, they got a different use case. I want to steal your intellectual property. I want to target it at your critical infrastructure. I want to target it maybe elections. I want to target for financial. They've got specific missions and they have specific teams that are working that. And in that, they are ahead, for sure. Now, on defense, we're pretty good on defense. We're pretty good on offense. I would say we're good not because public-private partnership, there is a good amount of that, but they're good because they've got a lot of money coming from a country that's driving it for a different purpose than what we're driving it for. I think we're now starting to understand we have to operate differently, not just public-private, like the four of us here, but unilaterally, because cyber doesn't have, tariffs and borders are all interesting. They're the rage these days, but cyber doesn't give a shit about that. And the more we raise tariffs and sanctions, I mean, look at the last 2 years. Where did ransomware come out and who did it attack?
Right.
The underbelly of our society and democracy and financials. And where did it come from? North Korea
yep.
and Russia within 90 days.
Yeah.
And you look today, it's still growing. And I think that becomes a thing we have to think differently about. The same thinking that got us here will not get us out of here. And so I think we have to remember, even though we're a country with sovereign rights, other countries are in different regimes than the country we are. And we have to think differently in how we respond. We've learned how to fight air, land, and sea. We're learning how to fight cyber. We have incredible capabilities, offensively and defensively, clearly.
So you noted that the vast increase, especially with more and more machines, and Bill, in your old life, you were one of the pioneers in identity and access management. And if you think about the human race, right, it took about 200,000 years for us to get to 1 billion people on the planet. It took about another 200 years to get us to where we are today, which is 7.7 billion people. And we've spent a lot of time and energy in this cyber arms race focusing on human identity management. But today, we actually have 23 billion devices connected to the internet.
Dimitri's point.
So each with its own identity. We have more than 3 times the device identities than human identities, and we've spent a fraction of our energy and effort on trying to manage those. So for all three of you, how do you, on the Internet of Things and how overwhelming it's going to be, aren't we actually inversely,
It's asymmetric.
we've under-prioritized the device threat, and the AI piece is a way that we might be able to catch up?
Yeah, I think we've got to think differently. There is asymmetric there. Dimitri, you said it. I mean, as you know, when we're at Intrust, we looked at how we deal with, you can't do people intervention on identity management. It needs to be software-based, whether it's private keys, public keys, whatever kind of software keys you want to use. And that's not just hardware to hardware, it's app to app. And now that's multidimensional because it's public cloud to private cloud to things that are disparately connected. 5G changes the world again, but we're already there. I mean, go back to Target. You personally know that one extremely well. And you look at our data, last year it was about 240% increase in IoT attacks. It was the largest single category of increasing. I go to the Hill a lot. If you ask any person, Republican or Democrat, what does IoT mean, they can't give you an answer. I mean, we don't know as a country how to describe between public and private what IoT is. And again, it's use case driven, but you got to start with some kind of framework to put it together. And right now, people just want to deploy. They just want to deploy. But guess what? Every one of those is connecting to some network. But we're just looking for speeds and cost right now, and not use cases saying, is it sensitive critical infrastructure data that's going back on energy to the control systems? Is it healthcare information that's attached to me? Is it something in my house? Is it in my damn refrigerator? I mean, it's everywhere, but we've got to think differently about what that ecosystem looks like in terms of the framework.
Chris, you were going to say something? Yeah.
I mean, this is really one of those things that I look at my partners in the UK. They've got an IoT code of practice. There are other countries that are doing things. They're just trying to find not grand bargains and not edge cases, but what are reasonable approaches for consumer IoT. It really drills down to 2 or 3 things, right? It needs to be patchable. Coordinated vulnerability disclosure programs and processes are a good thing. What does end of life cycle look like? What happens after that company goes bye-bye? And then it's not about the account management from if I'm logging in and changing the configuration of my camera. It's how is that thing being managed remotely by Telnet? I mean, there are things that we need to make sure that we get those 4 or 5 kind of key principles down, start pushing those out. But until we get just what a baseline of a secure design looks like, you talk about what companies spend on cyber spend. If it's 5%, 6%, I'd rather see a lot, and the same conversation goes for the cybersecurity workforce conversation. It's like, it's to a certain extent, it's fatalistic. Because we need to be putting more of the investment up front on just churning out more students that go through your program and through basic STEM programs, so we have a higher level of aptitude for coding. And through DevOps, you'll actually get to a more secure outcome if you roll it in from the beginning. So again, not segmenting these things out into, we've got really tight cybersecurity focus over here. Let's just have security baked in from the beginning.
That's it.
Well, on that point, Bill, you mentioned 5G, and and I used to be a telecom investment banker at Goldman, and one of the big things that we witnessed, and you lived this too, Bill, with your telecom background and the Bell Labs. Originally, the U.S. had the CDMA standard, but we also had GSM, TDMA, TSM. I mean, it was all over the map. The Europeans finally said, we're just going to adopt a standard GSM, and they went with one standard, and then were able to exploit the benefits of being able to rally around a single standard, even though that standard wasn't perfect. Today, we're on the cusp of 5G. There are a handful of things that are going to come in our lifetimes that arguably could really transform our lives. 5G is in that category, but it's going to enable machines to no longer have to go through routers to talk to each other. It would enable machine-to-machine direct language. So the attack surface is going to increase exponentially, and yet we don't have a single standard that we're rallying around. So Chris, I know for you and Dimitri, it's got profound implications. Bill, for you as well. Can each of you just talk a little bit about, do we need to have some effort at rallying around a single security standard for 5G that will be enabling even more and more machine learning and AI capability? Chris, do you want to start?
I mean, I think we're getting there through 3GPP, and I know I have folks that engage in that process. One country, one vote doesn't necessarily work out that way, because sometimes you find that country representatives are working for a company that is based in another country. So anyway, that's kind of the lightest
We're
way
going to get to Wally
that.
in a minute. That's my next thing.
But I think well, shoot, then I'll hold this. Your Bell Labs experience is really interesting, because what was the difference between now and the Bell Labs experience? Integrated tech stack.
You know what's interesting about this whole game, it's like deja vu.
Yeah.
And the one Chad didn't mention that he and I were talking a couple of days ago as we were talking about this issue. Being at Nortel, being at AT&T before, Japan had 30% of the mobile market.
Yep.
And if you were a telco provider or service provider, you had to deal with that, because it was a completely different standard. And you could never assume that you were going to play that, which is why CDMA, TDMA, and all that started happening in terms of it. I pull back to the product and the market itself. If you think 5G, you're going to be a successful provider without the US, you're on drugs. Now, if I talk to my engineers and my old engineers, which I do, they would say, it's never going to happen as fast as you think it is, because it's an ecosystem, not just the stack, but also the network. I mean, it's still Metcalfe's law on endpoints, right, in terms of the value of the network. And I think where the US is or is trying to be, of trying to get our own set of capabilities with security baked in and sources baked in for the telco carriers, the ISPs, endpoint devices. It's a really important thing to get right before you just go launch. And I'll flag that with one anecdote. Intel's really not in phones, but with all the exploits on side channel now, side channel attacks are coming about every 60 days. Now, they've not been weaponized, but it's been 2 years that China's had the knowledge of that. Russia, maybe 18 months now. That will be a country state hack. Now, the ones that are public are Intel.
Right.
But look, it's changing the stack. You can't hyper-thread anymore. If you do, travel at your own peril, because I will break you. Spoiler, port smash, either one of those. So I think you got to think differently as you look at that stack. And it does start with a chip, with all due respect, because that's everywhere. And it's not just in 5G. If you're in public cloud or private cloud or in a virtualized data center, side channel can hit you. And it will take whatever it wants. And I think that's something we've got to think about. And if it slows us down a little bit, it's not a bad thing. Because I can
what's
tell
a
you,
little bit?
I will be,
40%?
no, I'll be able to put 5G capability. I mean, we've got 5G emulation. No one's truly running 5G today.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be real. But even emulated 5G is better than 4G and 3G. So I think, so what are we doing? We're going to put 5G on our wireless capabilities. So, there are technologies out there today, maybe not to scale into the ecosystem today, more work. But if it's 3 to 5 years later, is that a big deal? Probably not, given the consequences of this. You said it earlier, Dimitri. We ran into the internet.
Yeah.
10 years later, we realized, oh shit.
We didn't make it security.
When we started quality, we didn't have the lexicon. Thank God for Deming and this cost of quality and all that crap. And I think that's where we are in that from a couple of points of view.
Well, Bill, and you said it goes all the way down to the stack, all the way to the chip level. And so, Dimitri, for you, I mean, you handle our nation's, or help secure our nation's nuclear arsenal. And historically, we've had a program called the Trusted Foundry Program, which hermetically more or less seals every chip that goes into a nuclear warhead. So we know from the grain of sand that made the silicon to the actual chip in the nuclear warhead that it was secure and had that standard. In this world that we're in now that Bill talked about, we don't have 5G security standard. And can you imagine, the Trusted Foundry Program appears to be too expensive to maintain. So how, in this new world, as you're trying to stay ahead of our adversaries by incorporating all the promise of 5G and AI, are you going to do it without having a supply chain technique like Trusted Foundry?
It's going to be hard, but I think we have to find our way through it. I first want to go back. I agree with Chris on standards, starting point. If you don't have that, you're kind of nowhere.
Yeah.
And trying to find a way to imbue that is really critical.
Do you have a favorite standard yet? Does DOE have a preferred standard?
I would say what Chris says.
Okay.
Is
Whatever Chris said. Okay.
Well,
That's a good rule of thumb.
But going back to chips, the thing is today, going back to kind of the wild west of AI today, it's not CPUs, it's not graphics processing units, it's not GPUs. There is a whole ecosystem that's emerging on special AI-based chips that do graph problems well, that are 100 times faster. They're smaller, they're more powerful, lower power, and they're tailored to learning. And they're fabless companies doing this. And they go to fabs like TSMC in Taiwan, but they'll probably go anywhere. And so therein lies another problem. You know, I don't think we know the technologies that will be embedded in the devices of the future that will be doing learning on the spot in your house, probably in multiple places, and passing along information in and out of your home and out of businesses and government offices. But it'll be happening, and I would guess that there will be novel chips made from companies like this that have found market that we have to keep an eye on. And I think, you know, I talked to a number of these companies, but there are easily, you know, 50 to 100 of these in the US right now. Smart people designing their own chips, building them overseas in foundries, and looking for those niche applications that will get them into the market. Which ones are going to end up the winners? Time will tell. That's kind of what we're facing. And then the question is, what is the implication of an ecosystem of these kinds of smart devices? Whether or not they come with standards or not, I don't know. I don't know how you would compel them, but you know, it's the right time to be having this conversation because all of this is developing right now.
Well, and it's encouraging to hear that DOE and you're actively in that dialogue with the private sector, with the innovation where it's happening, and especially on this issue of the chips and all the way down to the infrastructure, supply chain security. Before we open up to questions, I promised that we would definitely get to one of the hot topics of the day, Huawei. And so that's clearly been an area where there's significant supply chain security concerns. Back when I was a telecom banker, you know, I was proud of the fact that, you remember, Bill, in the days of, we had multiple American telecom equipment providers. There's not a single American 5G provider today. So Chris, we'll start with you, and I'll go to each of you. You know, given the risks around Huawei, that is significant. When I first learned about them, when I was a banker doing the China Mobile IPO in Asia, they only had 4% of the world market. Today they have 40. And so is it realistic for the US to be banning them? Are we ultimately going to have a bifurcated world where it's either Huawei or the Nokias and the Ericssons of the world? Is that where we're headed?
So let me just kind of give you my point of view, just stepping back a little bit. Kind of a three-part assessment here. One is China, okay? I think everybody increasingly, at least in this town, understands that there's a clear, distinct threat coming out of China. And this is not just conjecture or hypothetical. I mean, the APT-10 indictments, the hoovering up of data over the last decade plus, the continued engagement with the Chinese government over the last decade, and yet no appreciable change or democratization of the country. If you go look at, well, the second part of the test then is the way that they're operationalizing and they're weaponizing their tech sector. There is no distinction between the private sector and the Communist Party of China, or the PLA for that matter, their military. They are simply one organism that is using the various tools and levers available to it to achieve the priorities of the government. Now, when you look at the quality of what Huawei or the other countries are pushing out, I go look to the UK and their oversight board. They issued a report this past year that's one of the most damning pieces of assessment product I've ever read. I mean, and even the technical director of the National Cybersecurity Center in the UK said like 2 weeks ago, he says, Huawei products are objectively worse than the competitors. And the worst part about that is it's not like it's a big reveal, like, oh, all of a sudden they're bad. No, they've been doing this assessment process, this oversight board, for 10 years, and it has not improved. In 10 years, there has been no bootstrapping. There's been no improvement quality. So I moved to the third part of the assessment. This is a forward-leaning assessment. We're about to build out this generational leap in terms of telecommunications, and we want to put hardware that manages the control plane of the communications infrastructure that is working at the behest of an adversarial nation. The quality of the product's crap. The way they manage it is with their resources here, deployed here. I just land in a final risk assessment position. It's like, I don't know how we could get here. Go talk to the Europeans. Say, look, if it was a Russian company trying to build out your 5G network,
How would you
let them do that? I think we're pretty, we can all guess what the response would be. The good news is, despite I think what you read in the newspaper or whatever, I was in NATO in Brussels, NATO North Atlantic Council meeting. Every NATO allied partner I talked to in the security services gets it. Clear-eyed, gets it. 100% gets it. But there are longer-term financial and economic entanglements that don't make the decisions as easy as it does here in the US, because we made decisions 10 years ago when smart people like you were in charge. There were decisions made a decade ago that put us in a position where we can say, you know what, we're not going to deal with them. Now, that's not to say we're scot-free. There are a lot of rural carriers that have some products baked in that we're going to have to look at. What are those how do we get them from the have-nots into the have category?
Gotcha. Dimitri, from your perspective, how does DOE look at Huawei and the threat that it poses to your interests, to the department?
I think there's the generic piece. What I'd like to say ditto, because I think with Chris's passion on that point, I think these are all the things that we worry about. It's about supply chain. It's about where the networks are going, where the connectivity is going. It's something we worry about because we have to provide guarantees in our day job, and trying to do that when there are big uncertainties because of the provenance of components or code or things like that is something we really worry about. And we're all going to have to work together to figure out our way through this one.
Thank you.
But we need a solution here that provide us the guarantees fundamentally that for the things that matter.
So would it be fair to say it's not a BPA, but it's a call out to the private sector to come forth with supply chain security solutions that DOE could look at?
I think it has to be in all of the above, because this is touching all of us in everything we do.
Yeah.
But sorry to do this,
that's-
but obviously I care very much about this topic.
It's a little.
Again, go back to the Bell Labs conversation. What was the difference between then and now? You had an integrated tech stack that could do you could just roll in.
Well, let's start with, you had government funding
Right.
Yeah.
and programs for Bell Labs.
And then you broke up Bell Labs, and then you
You
deregulated
broke
in the
up
90s.
AT&T
Right.
and Bell Labs,
Yes.
which then created
The baby bells.
Bell North and a baby neutered Bell Labs in the US. And having lived in both the AT&T of that and the Nortel side, let's start with China Initiative first. And the first China Initiative is Silk Road China 2025. That plan is not timid. It's pretty direct what that is. And
Bill,
I'm
for
a
those
cat-
that may not be familiar, do you want to just say what that is?
Well, I'll let you do that.
Yeah.
You're probably more adept in doing
Yeah.
that. I'll stay out of the
Okay.
politics of it.
But yeah, so the Chinese have issued a vision document of where they want to, and they've literally listed out in Made in China 2025, it's a laundry list of here are the technologies that we view as critical and that we will ultimately be making organically in our own home front. So I think.
So in that context, I move from the AT&T where it was vertically integrated to Nortel, who, guess what happened? They're gone.
Yeah.
Now, there are a million other reasons, but who took that source code?
Definitely.
Who's using that source code today? So to me, and we've experienced Entrust with, they'd love to have our encryption technology code. We live that.
Yeah.
So I look at the ecosystem of that. There is no public-private. It's all public. It's a country-sponsored state, all the way down to the province or state, if you will.
It's subsidized. it's
Subsidized and
financed,
funded.
it's-
And by the way, with all due respect, I'm in firewalls. You worry about chips. Well, who's the biggest firewall in the world?
Yeah. PRC. Yeah.
Is there an IQ test required here? There is. Because, excuse me, who's brokered with Huawei? And by the way, they're in businesses all over the US, including governments here. So I'm not going to push out an update. By the way, they're getting all their intel for their firewall. Like, come on, people, wake up. Like, we got to think differently. We've got to think differently. This is not casual goddamn. And the problem, if you're private, is where's the biggest market if you're in the US? It's India or China. So the question is, will you sell your soul, or will they compromise your soul if you go try to run for that market? And so
I think on that point, it's a good one, but it's also, don't assume, and you know this based on your balance sheet, it's the decisions that are being made today are different than the decisions that were made 5 years ago. I think there are a number of companies that saw 5 years ago China as the next great opportunity. There are a number of companies that are today looking at it saying, that wasn't the opportunity we thought. Why? Because of things like Made in China 2025 that have indigenous targets for indigenous product deployments. And so, look, what I've said is that you're only going to be as successful in China as that country lets you be.
That's
and
right.
As soon as they have either pilfered your IP and replicated it and replaced you, you're done. You are done. You're not just done there, you're done here. Go look at Motorola.
Well,
and it is, the challenges being introduced domestically here because of intellectual property theft from 30 years ago.
That's right.
It's shocking.
So those, the sins abroad can be felt at home. And I think this will be the last question, and then I'd like to open it up to the audience. For both DHS and DOE, for companies like SonicWall that have committed to having a very well curated and protected supply chain, that costs money. It's more expensive to do that. Do you all plan on giving preference, if you've got supplier A and supplier B, supplier A is taking the extra cost and precaution to protect their supply chain, will that be more and more explicit in the procurement requirements as we get into the supply chain debate in the coming days?
So I think Department of Defense, Under Secretary Lord's shop and acquisition and sustainment has done some good stuff lately.
Yeah.
I think there was an announcement last week where cybersecurity is an allowable cost. I always look at DoD, they tend to be much more aggressive in the DFARs and they get away with stuff that I am very jealous of. But let them kind of test and pilot things and see what we can do to bring that into the broader civilian agency, the network deployments. But I think we've got to get out of a model of lowest price technically acceptable.
What's the UK model?
Work.
What Ian's doing with NCSC, where they're getting away from FIPS and common criteria and just going best, adequate, or not.
So there's more that can be done here for sure, and I think you're seeing a shift in the market. I think it makes, I know when I've in the old private sector hat on, it makes a lot of people uncomfortable that we're getting into these maturity models and things like that. But something's got to change. I mean, something has got to change in the way we do business. What I'm looking to do and see where we can push this out is what additional services can I push out, whether it's my cyber hygiene scanning to hit really at the third, fourth, fifth tier subcontractors that sit in that have-not space.
Right.
We got to do this in a way that is consistent with shared responsibility. You, as the network owner, are responsible for your cybersecurity. But if there's a market failure somewhere, how do I fleet in, and how do I provide my scanning capabilities? How do I do some more sophisticated capability over top with classified signatures, things of that nature? We've got to be more creative, I think. And
But
break out
Chris,
the
at
toolkit.
least now we have NIST looking to create that framework for SMB.
Yep.
It's not just enterprise.
Right.
And that's our first opportunity to truly intersect what you're trying to do tactically with stuff like SonicWall and what other people are doing out in the real world, to bring that public-private piece to DHS, NIST, and the Hill, because that I really think is the first time in 30 years this government's pivoted from enterprise or banks or the regulated entities into the underbelly of our economy and democracy.
But it's too hard. It is too hard to achieve security or cybersecurity, whatever the hell it is. We've got to get to this point where there's a consolidation or at least better partnership, I think, out there between the IT service providers and the security providers. So you can have, for those SMBs, you're not going to be able to have them deal with 55 vendors knocking on the doors. Like, what does that integrated model look like? And I think that's happening right now in the market. It's going to take some time. But that's just, I think that's one of the pressure points that I think we need to see.
Well, that's actually a good positive note to amongst the gloom and doom. There are signs of light and hope. So why don't we do this? I'd like to open it up now to the audience for questions that you all may have of our guests. And if I could start, if you could say your name and who you're with. Yep.
Don McClain with DLT Solutions. This is a little bit off topic, but it's a question for Dimitri, I think, specifically. For about 20 years now, we've been 10 years away from a quantum computer. What's your take on the future and viability of quantum computing?
So there are different parts to try and answer. So first, there are things you can do with qubits today. The question is, what is the problem you're actually trying to solve? There's interesting science you can do. There's a collection of interesting technologies that derive from understanding qubits and quantum systems across the board, of which quantum computing is a special pocket with unique applications. If you look just at quantum computing narrowly in terms of something you want to deploy to solve a particular problem, it's still got a ways to go. It is still a hard problem. And it's hard in many dimensions, not just scientifically, but from the engineering point of view, from how you would extract things from it, the ecosystem you build around it. It's got many different complex pieces that have to be solved simultaneously. There's a lot of progress going on, but it isn't just, it's not on a Gantt chart right now. They're still going to take innovation to get there.
I'm glad you asked that question, Don. And it plays right into the areas of AI. One of the areas, too, in cyber is encryption. And I think there's been a lot of concern over what happens in a post-quantum world for encryption. So,
You just hit
Chris,
the grand slam, though.
5G,
5G, AI, quantum.
we're going to leave here until we got that in here.
There you go.
So, but Chris, you're right in the crosshairs of this debate. Obviously, we used to have a thing called the Communications Assistance, the Law Enforcement Act, CALEA. The FBI has been pushing hard for what I'll call CALEA 2, or son of CALEA, which would mandate some backdoor in every cell phone to have lawful access for warrants. We've seen our Australia pass a law that's requiring their cellular companies to do that. The UK appears to be on the cusp of doing that. What's DHS's view or your view on, is that really achievable without introducing essentially a disadvantage to U.S. providers? The Chinese and others will continue to have their concerns about Apple. If they have a backdoor in the U.S., are they going to have a backdoor in China?
So this is one of those kind of persistent, really hard policy conversations. Last administration tussled with it. I think the current we're looking at this now. From where I sit, and thank you for allowing me to scope it down, as the cybersecurity agency, particularly protecting federal agencies, we encourage and prioritize the encryption of data to ensure that the adversary can't, do what they've done in other cases. But at the same time, it does make it harder for me when I'm looking, particularly using ML tools, when I'm doing deep packet inspection. If the traffic's encrypted, my ability to inspect is limited. So from a network defender perspective, it is a good thing, and yet it hinders me. So I've got to go look and innovate and look for other opportunities. And I think that's in part where we're going to have to go on the law enforcement lawful access to data conversation. It's okay, what are the challenges we have, but where else can we innovate? Where else can we continue to push the other capabilities to access? But at the same time, really narrowing the lines. What is the problem we're trying to solve here? And getting really crisp on that question.
Okay, great, thank you.
That's my non-answer.
That's very well done.
Thanks.
Anyone? Yes, sir. Sorry, who are you with? What's your name?
Ambuj Kumar with Photonics.
Okay, yes.
So I was listening to your discussion on challenges in collecting sensitive and private data and feeding into AI for better model generation, right? Especially in this part of the world. So now there are secure enclaves, such as Intel Software Guard extension, and they can allow you to collect very private data without ever exposing them to even root adversary or privileged software, and that way you can constrain use of that data. Have you looked at any of this, and what's your view if you have?
So, I'm not so worried about securing the data. We certainly do that with HIPAA data. We host with PII, with various amounts of classified information. And so that's not the piece. The question is, what is the data you should be looking or shouldn't be looking at? When we think about our enterprise of almost 100,000 people under the DOE umbrella in terms of all our sites and labs and people, and you think then about all the ways you could get into things. We host secrets that have no expiration date, and we worry about networks and adversaries. Everyone, or a lot of people today, have a huge social media presence. They're out there in various ways. There's a lot of data outside, publicly available, and we look inside at how the data that we control within our system, and we assess risk. But, there's a whole other piece of the data world that we could imagine looking at, that I imagine others are, as you piece together vulnerabilities from all the data that people willingly or openly put out there, as well as all the third-party data integrators that are out there buying and selling your data. If you've applied for a loan or a credit card, they have you cut 50 different ways in terms of how to characterize you, and they impute the data they don't have. And so there's a lot of data moving around on each of us. And as you think about AI now and what you could learn from that, as you think about how to target enterprises, the privacy issue that comes to mind is, well, what data should we be touching and looking at? And so it's a slightly different, more on the ethical side, that we have to get our head around on what is appropriate use of data to adequately protect our enterprises in a world where people will be able to you can take a photograph and geotag it pretty easily now anywhere in the world, just a beach, a road, or a picture of you somewhere. And they could place your movement just from social media and other postings. And there are a lot of things that will emerge as interesting, relevant information as you cobble all this together, which could provide a means to think about vulnerabilities in systems that are outside of simply technical threats. And what that means in terms of data aggregation and privacy is still unexplored. And again, I know there'll be places you can store it. The question is, what should we store? And I don't know the answer to that, but it's an important question.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
I can speak about this one. So I have a question.
Hey, tell us your name.
Yeah, my name's Rohit, and I am from a company called TechMonks. We're in the cybersecurity space. So I have a question. There is a trinity of threats out there. One is AI, one is 5G. There's a third one, IPv6. IPv6 is big enough that the address space can assign an IP to every atom on the planet of Earth. And it takes currently about 500,000 atoms to store 1 bit. What I'm trying to get at is, mathematically, it's impossible to store enough data for IPv6 to analyze it, even if you use the entire planet as your storage device.
So we're going to have to go to other
yeah,
planets.
so what is our plan for even analyzing? So today, for example, if I'm on Comcast, I'm on IPv6. So the analysis algorithms fail for IPv6. So have you thought about that?
I might only add, look, there are a lot of combinatorially complex problems, in complexity theory, things called, NP-hard. In logistics problems, they're like this. And there are examples where people find still ways to try and maneuver through there. The AlphaGo the game Go, the game chess. These are similar complex problems with an exponentially large space of options that you can't train or look at everything, but you can still, through a balance of heuristics and expertise and strong algorithms, you can still outperform people, or you can now, in interesting ways. With StarCraft, with poker, they're funny places. So I think we'll probably find different ways through this. We're faced with lots of combinatorially hard problems, but I don't think it's hopeless, because we've seen by example in the past few years, clever use of learning methods has at least revealed potential pathways and how to think about this.
And so last time I thought about it was at Interest, when you had to figure out how you're going to identify all the IP6 devices, which was an own combination of issues. As we look at it now from where we sit relative to it, we don't think of IP6 devices as just devices. I mean, it's kind of the IoT thing we were talking earlier. How do you aggregate it? They're all connected to something. So that you got to start with what's connected to what and what matters out of that. Because otherwise, you will never do it, to your point. And I think, I hate to say use case again, but you can't boil the ocean. And we've got to get much smarter about how things are being aggregated and for what purposes. And that's, I said forever and a day, the difference with how governments are going to have to work with private enterprise. And I used to, DOE was a client, still is. I mean, DOE's got to work with universities, and it's got to work with the providers of those utilities. That's the public-private. They do that every day. We just got to change the dialogue so it's more around cyber and that. Commerce works every day with certain businesses, right? Treasury works with banks. I mean, we've got to use the natural public-private partnerships that already exist. We just need to change the dialogue in terms of, as we are doing now, in terms of what we're talking about.
I'm glad you brought it up, Rohit, because we're starting to hear more discussion of IPv6, but we haven't. It's certainly been overshadowed by 5G, as you said, or AI. So thank you for raising it. I also think one other paradigm that we've talked about is when I was at Homeland Security, one of the most frustrating things is the asymmetric nature of the adversary, where they only have to be right 1% of the time, but we have to be right 100% of the time. And this paradigm that you've mentioned, which is overwhelming, another paradigm to shift that against the adversary is to start to whitelist. In other words, rather than letting everything through and hoping we catch the one bad actor, we basically say, nobody comes in unless you're whitelisted, and then we're going to let you through. And so I think those are the kinds of things that Bill's talking about in terms of paradigm shifts, where we can, or Dimitri, think about the problem in a different way. But thanks for raising that. Okay. One more time for one more question, and otherwise we'll wrap it up. To be fair to my guests, I'm going to let them know. I'm going to come to them with asking them to give us one last closing remark about something that we don't know right now that would be really important that you want us to leave this event with. So before we get to that, any last question? Yes?
Yeah, one right there.
Okay, sorry.
I grabbed them. Testing 1, 2, 3. I guess it works. My name's Patrick Hearn. I'm with Endeavor Worldwide. And just listening to the session over the course of the past hour or so, what really struck me is that we are talking about playing catch-up constantly on a number of subject matters. And I have to wonder, most of the approach has been about what can we do here in the United States? And yet, at the same time, I think about where innovation, cybersecurity innovation, large portions of it actually come out. And I can't help but wonder what sort of activity is, for example, DHS outside of an S&T directorate or Department of Energy as part of some of their placements and investments. have we given some thought about looking at those sorts of what I call real interesting technologies that are outside of the United States and trying to build it in a manner that understands the relationships with those sorts of organizations as being what I would call serving American interests? Because that's something I haven't really seen from a philosophical approach before in the various agencies I spend my time in.
It's a great question, really good question. And we've seen, when I was in the CIA, one of my first assignments was to work with InQtel when Russ Hayward and Louis Gilman started that. And that was an effort to find those new innovations that would be applicable in the national security space, but it was very US-centric. And I think we've seen Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, DIUX, is now DIU. It's full. It's no longer experimental, but it's still largely domestic too. So I am curious about whether you guys are looking abroad.
So I mean,
You're going to go to Israel next week. If I
yep.
remember right.
So going to Cyber Week for
There you
Israel
go.
next week. There goes my OPSEC. Thanks.
Oh, sorry.
Former
I know.
CIA agent, no less. So I think any way you cut it, I think the U.S. is still the market leader globally in cybersecurity, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. The Israelis are pretty good, but ultimately, when I look at partnerships globally, for me, it's really simple today. It's boiling down to, are you a democracy or not? And it makes things a lot easier for how we partner, whether it's a conversation on 5G, whether it's a conversation on hybrid threats, including election interference and disinformation. We know who we can partner with. And again, go back to my NATO conversation. Things are a lot clearer right now on who we can work with and who we can partner with in this space. And so, yeah, I talked to the Israelis, the Brits, huge partners, but even as we move back the other way, Japan, Australia, Singapore, there are a lot of partners out there that want to get in this game together because they're all facing the same kind of digital authoritarian threats. And again, there's a self-sorting mechanism happening right now, and again, it makes the partnerships easier.
That's great. Dimitri?
I think we partner with whomever we can. I mean, the problems we have are hard, and we find any way to try and solve them. We go to the market when market forces can drive that. We go internationally. We have robust engagement with international partners on key issues we've identified as, we need to work together to help. Work with academia when that makes sense, and we use our national labs to fill the gaps when we can't find any other way to do it. So, I think our model is, where are the best ideas, and how do we partner to draw those into our problems? Because ultimately, we want to solve our problems. Whether it's the grid or the energy sector, the nuclear sector, or the strategic petroleum reserve, or pick your problem that we have, the cyber dimensions we own. These are all things that won't have single technology solutions. We'll need protracted engagement as they evolve, and we need strong ideas coming in, and we certainly don't have the monopoly on that.
That's great. So Peter, I think to answer your question, it looks like, Patrick, I'm sorry, thank you. It looks like that they're going to find the best minds wherever they are. The other thing I'd say is welcome after, we're going to have a reception here in just a minute, and if you have other ideas on how folks can, the government can tap that talent abroad, please bring that forward. And I actually acknowledged my good friend Larry Pfeiffer here before I knew you had the mic, so I will let you ask Larry if you'd like that last question you have. Real quick.
So the title of this series refers to the cyber arms race. And if you look through history at other arms races, we reach a point where internationally we get together and we come up with ways to both regulate activities. So, you shouldn't be lobbing chemical weapons on your adversary. Or we have controlled technologies. So through nuclear technology, the COCOM back during the Cold War. So has the cyber arms race, is arms race an appropriate construct? And if it is, where are we in the United States in addressing this internationally? And do you see the cyber arena as something that could be controlled in those same ways.
That's a good, and
That's a
that
great
actually,
ending
it's a
question.
great ending question. You teed it up beautifully. So why don't, as you think about that, is it a real arms race? And if so, are we winning it? And as we part here, any last thoughts that you want? We'll end with you, Bill. Start, Chris. With
Yeah, I
you.
like the
Yep.
way you reframe that, a very binary question.
Yeah.
Are we winning it? Far too complex to
Yes.
put within even just calling it an arms race. I think there are a number of efforts afoot. Again, go back to NATO, Article 5, options. There was a London decision a couple weeks ago that said, cyber attack within Article 5 context is in play. Then you've got other agreements, the Wassenaar agreements that look at dual-use technologies and certain applications that are kind of should be subject to control. So I think there's a growing body of evidence. It's almost kind of like our legal system, right? You build it over time based on experience and use cases, to beat that term to death. They're not single solutions, whether from a cybersecurity solution or from a legal regime, and we're just going to have to continue to move through, and that's the kind of the challenge here, and that's why you continually hear, regardless of the administration, Democrat or Republican, regulation moves too slow for the innovation base. We have to continue pushing the edge in terms of innovating, and that's the same thing for the defensive measures. But if I've learned anything in the last couple of years, and particularly as it's talking about elections, you got to plan for a bad day. You're gonna have a bad day. What happens that bad day? Are you ready?
It's a good thought to leave on. Thank you, Chris. Dimitri?
So, being also, a mathematician, I kind of sometimes try and distill these things into more abstractions to try and understand questions like this. And so, with the arms race, certainly with the Cold War, game theory was a useful mechanism to try and understand moves and counter moves and strategies. And it's when you try and apply those methods to something like cyber or technologies, even AI that are democratized, where the number of players is myriad, it's different, and if you tried to apply the same type of game theory constructs, you would find that it doesn't work the same way. The games are actually very chaotic, and being able to predict what happens is different. And I think there's something fundamentally different for technologies that have low entry points, that allow small groups or rogue actors to do things that can be significant, and you can't think about it in the same conventional way, or you'll constantly be in a triage mode. I think there's some fundamentally rooted in that we have not yet figured out how to regulate against, because it has too many moving parts, and it's just not a couple of things to fix.
So your challenge, Dimitri, is to us as in industry, don't think conventionally, and help us think outside the box on this. Bill?
I'll try to be succinct. We are in a cyber arms race. There is no question. And it's not just with country states, it's with organized crime and individuals. I mean, this doesn't have to be a country state sponsored thing anymore, as we've learned. So yes, 100% we're in a cyber arms race. That said, you got to remember, if you're in an arms race, it's a war. So there's going to be battles won and battles lost. We have certainly got tremendously better at the government and high-end enterprise. We have miles to go before we sleep in small business and protecting that, and even more to go between public-private partnership. We've got to remember, we are the number one target. We've got the most money, we've got the most intellectual property, and we are a democracy. And like it or hate it, that puts a big target on you. That said, I'm from Texas, so we play a lot of football. It's working, now it's not. It's working, now it's not. The challenge is learn what's working and expand that as quickly as possible. And when it doesn't work, quickly learn from it and move on. So that would be my thing, is you're gonna see things happen, but as a country, we're in a much better position than we've probably ever been. But in this cyber arms race, we're behind. I think the gentleman adequately said it. We're behind the offensive capability shooting at us because it's asymmetric. This is not easy, and it's vast. It's a vast, complex issue.
Well, thank you. And I think we've all learned a lot today and appreciate, thanks to these gentlemen and their experience, what a complex problem is. It is encouraging, though, that even though the arms race, the cyber arms race is in full swing, it's through this type of dialogue with the private and the public sector coming together, putting our best ideas on the table, just like with the Moonshot or the Manhattan Project, we can address this concern and challenge for our nation. So thank you all for your service. Thank you, Bill, for your commentary, and we look forward to inviting everybody. We're standing now between you and drinks at the reception, so we look forward to seeing you there. Thanks, everybody. Well done.
Great job. Thank you.